Good afternoon, everyone. As I said in yesterday's lesson, we just needed to finish off the final few strands of the lesson yesterday. We need to, this is the lesson about the military collapse of 1918, and what we didn't really get onto was the final key part, which was the October reform. So we need to talk through what that was about. If you can have your mind map in front of you and have your class notes in front of you, and we'll follow the usual format. You'd be thankful you don't have to have me on the screen the whole time. I just thought I'd have me on the screen for the opening slide. I'm going to sort of move on to where we reached in yesterday's lesson. Just bear with me because I've got to scroll through all of the slides, but that in itself can be quite useful because it'll just remind you of what we covered in yesterday's lesson, and then we'll pick up at the point about the stab in the back myth, and I'll talk you through the October reform, and that'll get us all to the same point. So when I have our next lesson, which will be, I think, Wednesday next week, we'll be ready to sort of move into the events of November 1918 when the war actually ended. Okay, so let's move on. So I'm just scrolling through the slides for the moment until we get to where we finished off. Just pause at that particular point because I remember when we in the lesson yesterday, I was just sort of highlighting to you, and I've got the interactive whiteboard on my iPad here. So the border, the German border, which I'll mark here for you, I'll choose a different colour. I'll use green. Okay, so this line here is the border between Germany and Belgium to the north and France further down. So you get a definite sense there, don't you? Again, I'll just use a slightly different colour pen. I'll use red, okay, for the German advance. How at the beginning of the war, how far Germany had advanced, and as I say, had got stuck in trench warfare for much of the years late 1914 through until 1918, and then in March 1918 suddenly the Germans recommenced that advance, and they were able to do that, remember, because they thought the war because the war in the east had been in effect won. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, remember, the new government of Russia, the Bolshevik government led by Lenin, basically surrendered to Germany. By the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany annexed huge swathes of territory from Russia and was able to move 52 extra divisions over to the Western Front, and so pushed a long way further into France. And as you can see, there's Paris. So yeah, the sort of general feeling was with that advance that it would be a matter of weeks before they actually took the French capital. But then suddenly, in August 1918, it all began to go wrong. And what then happened is there was basically a about turn. Okay, just I don't know if you can see the arrows, but basically Germany turned into retreat, and what Hindenburg and Ludendorff desperately wanted to do is they wanted to halt the war. They wanted to call the war to an end on the Western Front before any German soldiers retreated back onto German territory. In other words, crossed that green line that I've marked on the map there. End the war in effect while they were still on foreign territory. And that was the sort of desperate situation. So I'll just carry on going through the slides. Yeah, so again, using that sort of image, what was now happening, just put the arrows on a bit more clearly here, so just bear with me, just zoom. So what was now happening is German troops were in retreat, and they were rapidly reaching the point where they were crossing, or they were on the risk of crossing that green line which marks the frontier, and if they crossed over that green line, then they would be retreating back onto German soil, and of course the French, the British and the Americans would be moving on to German soil. So it was to end the war before that situation had arisen. So giving that sort of context then, remember back home in Germany, okay, hundreds of miles away, in the German cities, we would call the home front, where the civilians were working hard and had been working hard for 4 years, toiling on the fields, growing the food, working in the factories to make the weapons. The impact of the blockade, the food shortages, and the shock that the war was taking so long was really, really having its toll. And remember, of course, that declining morale was reflected in the Reichstag, in the German parliament. Now, within the German parliament, of course, in 1917, the politician Erzberger had tabled a motion that we do not want to continue the war, and that peace resolution, as it was called, had been passed by the Reichstag. But of course, by that point, by 1917, the Reichstag was effectively being bypassed. Okay, it was never really that powerful anyway, even before 1914. Remember, Germany was a fairly autocratic system. Okay, the parliament, the Reichstag, created a sort of illusion of democracy, but really the Reichstag was never really listened to. The head of government, the Chancellor, was accountable to the Kaiser himself, didn't really have to give account to the people as represented in the Reichstag. And by 1917, that was even worse, because of course Hindenburg and Ludendorff had effectively taken over the running of government. Even the Chancellor himself had very, very little power, and of course Bethmann Hollweg, the Chancellor, had been dismissed, manoeuvred out of office by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the new military dictators of Germany, who were effectively making their own decisions by this particular point. Okay, so there'd been this groundswell of a feeling in the Reichstag that had been saying, we want to end the war, and of course Hindenburg and Ludendorff had ignored it because they thought they could win the war. Okay, but now, a year later, as we get to the summer of 1918, they're feeling pretty stupid. Okay, because they thought they were about to win the war. Okay, they'd been able to shift 52 divisions over to the west, and they'd advanced suddenly deep into France, but now they're in rapid retreat for a whole range of reasons. It was partly to do with America coming into the war on the side of the British and the French, but it was mainly to do with Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They made tactical errors, they made strategic errors on the Western Front. It was mainly a failure of the fighting on the Western Front, for which they were responsible. But the point is they didn't want to carry that responsibility. They knew that now they were in retreat, and like, typical cowards, bullies, they simply wanted to pass the responsibility on to somebody else. Okay, so what they basically did is they persuaded Hindenburg to sack Michaelis as the Chancellor and to appoint a man called Prince Max of Baden, who was then given the job to go back to the Reichstag. And remember, the Reichstag had been ignored throughout the war, basically, and to go back to the Reichstag and say, hey, you know what? yeah, you're right. You've got some good ideas, the Reichstag. We're going to listen to you now, and we will give you what you want. We will end the war, okay? And even better than that, we will give you, the people, more say in the running of the country in the future. And the hope was that by doing this, that effectively it would deflect the blame for the end of the war to the Reichstag. Okay, it would deflect the responsibility to the people back in Germany, but also another aim was that it would it would encourage, or it would make the ordinary German people feel like the war hadn't been a complete waste of time, that they had got something out of it, which in the end would channel the discontent away from what the Hindenburg and Ludendorff and the Kaiser were most afraid of, which was that Germany would follow the same pathway as what had happened in Russia, which was a full-blown revolution that had removed the elites, the upper classes of Russia, and they were afraid a similar sort of thing was going to happen in Germany. Okay, so that's the sort of background about the appointment of Prince Max of Baden. So that's kind of like the position that we had reached on that slide there by last lesson, and we were just reaching this sort of like slide then about Ludendorff's volteface. Okay, now basically what we mean by a volteface means literally a change in direction, and that's what I just explained to you there. Okay, so let's go through that to make sure that you're comfortable with that sort of concept. Okay, so what was Ludendorff's change in direction? That's the first question. So the change of direction is this, okay? Ludendorff suddenly, out of the blue, announced that Germany must now end the war. Okay, and that's something that he had never wanted to do. But up to now, he's always said, we will fight to the end and we will win the war, okay? And it will be an annexationist war. Now, suddenly, he's saying we need to end the war, okay? And secondly, he suddenly announced that we need also to introduce political reform in Germany. Okay, so we need to change the system. We need to give more political power to the ordinary people. And again, that was completely the opposite of everything he believed in. So it's a complete about turn in what he actually believes. But he suddenly made that announcement. And remember, he made that announcement at the beginning of October 1918, just 4 or 5 days after Bulgaria, which was one of Germany's main allies in the war, suddenly announced that they were pulling out of the war. The general feeling is that when Bulgaria made that announcement on the 29th of September, that really was the sort of straw that broke the camel's back, and it made Ludendorff realise we're not going to win the war. Okay, we've lost an ally in Bulgaria, and on the other side, the British and French have gained an ally in the USA. Okay, so the balance is tilted against Germany. So in the nutshell, the in a nutshell slide there, sort of like which we read through in yesterday's lesson, sort of summarises that. Let's just go into the sort of detail then, which was the point we had reached last lesson. Just make sure we're clear. Okay, so the German military was anxious. In other words, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the leaders of the fighting on the Western Front, was anxious that an announcement that the war was lost, which is what they need to do because they're in rapid retreat, okay, and that all the fighting for the last 4 years had achieved nothing, which is what would happen if Germany suddenly surrenders now. The people back in Germany are going to think, well, what was that all about? We spent 4 years, 2 million people have died, for what? Okay, and so Hindenburg and Ludendorff and the Kaiser, the elites in general, were desperately worried that if Germany were just to announce that by itself, just to say, right, we're surrendering, we're ending the war, we're putting up the white flag, that at home that actually might light the fire of revolution. It might spark revolution. We've got simmering discontent in Germany anyway. We've had 500,000 ordinary Germans on strike in the first half of 1918. You've got soldiers deserting the army. You've got food shortages. And even worse, of course, you've got the rumours about what's happening in Russia, and everyone's talking about it, and they're saying in Russia the ordinary people have overthrown the rich and they've created a socialist state in which all wealth is shared evenly amongst everybody. And the big fear was that the ordinary German people, if they suddenly hear this message that we've suddenly ended the war all for nothing, that they're just simply, that's it. We can't stand these rich people who've put us in this awful situation, and let's follow what our Russian brothers in arms have done and topple the rich, topple the middle classes, topple the upper classes, and create a socialist state. That was the big anxiety. Okay, so the feeling was, and this is the three reasons for the change in direction. The first reason was, okay, this. If we simultaneously, whilst announcing that we're ending the war, couple that announcement with a declaration that we will change the constitution, and in the future ordinary Germans will have genuine political power, it might take the sting out of that defeat. Okay, it might make people realise that it might convince ordinary people, so just changing my pens here, that they had actually got something from the war after all. But most importantly, from the viewpoint of people like Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who were from the upper classes, the military leaders, and also the Kaiser, it would reduce the risk of Germany going through what had happened in Russia. In other words, a socialist revolution, which would completely topple the elites, the upper classes. So by offering political reform, it was basically about saving their own skins. Okay, it was about making sure that the old order, the elites, the upper classes, would at least retain some power. It may be weakened because they're going to have to give greater say to the ordinary people in the future, but at least they would not go the same way as the Tsar and the Russian nobility had gone, which was basically they were toppled and butchered, okay, in a socialist revolution. So that's the sort of first reason for the about change. There were two other reasons though, okay, and the second reason was this, okay, Germany had no choice. Now, America had come into the war on the side of the British and the French, and when America came into the war, the American President Woodrow Wilson, and there's a picture of him there, okay, the President of the USA, had basically very clearly said, through a declaration that was known as the 14 Points, and he very clearly said that in a peace treaty with Germany, that if Germany puts up the white flag and surrenders, which is what Ludendorff now wants to do, that any peace treaty that's going to be signed after that surrender between the Allies, British, French and Americans, and Germany, that the peace treaty must insist that Germany must change the way in which they organise their political affairs, that Germany must become a democratic country, okay? That Germany cannot continue being an autocracy, an authoritarian system in which there is an emperor who has most of the political power for himself. Basically, Woodrow Wilson says, it has made very clear that when the war ends, the Reichstag needs to be given more power, okay? And that's part of the conditions of surrender, and that America will not be prepared to negotiate peace terms with the leaders of the German army unless there is that assurance that the new Germany will become a democracy. Okay, so in the end, really, there is no choice. So that's the second reason. Then the third reason is all to do with the stab in the back. And that's the point which I made earlier about shifting the responsibility, okay? Because it's kind of like linked to the first 2 points. If, coupled with the surrender, the German elites, the Kaiser and Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the people who've been controlling the decision making in the corridors of power, if they suddenly say, right, okay, well, we will give more power to the ordinary people who are represented in the Reichstag. In other words, we will pass power down to the Reichstag. We'll give the Reichstag much greater say in government. Okay, over to you guys then. You guys can basically sign the peace treaty. Okay, so we'll pass their responsibility for negotiating the surrender terms over to the Reichstag. And of course, the Reichstag is dominated by the left wing and the centre political parties. So when the peace treaty is presented to us to sign, okay, by the British, French and Americans, and no doubt the terms will be pretty harsh. Why will they be harsh? Because, of course, Germany had been very, very harsh at Brest-Litovsk in imposing a dictated peace on Russia. So we, the Germans, have got to expect it's going to be a pretty tough peace treaty imposed on Germany. And it's going to be very unpopular with the German people. Well then, when the terms of the peace treaty are published, we, the army leaders, will be able to pass the blame for Germany's defeat onto the Reichstag politicians that signed the peace treaty, and in particular the left-wing political parties who control the Reichstag. So we'll be able to wash our hands of the peace treaty, okay, we the army leaders. We'll be able to say it wasn't our fault, okay. The reason Germany has lost the war is because of those spineless, weak-willed left-wing politicians back in Berlin, 400 miles behind the fighting front. We, the soldiers, were winning the war, and we have been stabbed in the back by the politicians on the home front. Now, of course, that's a lie, okay? We've just done the history, haven't we? We've said that basically the German army was in full retreat, okay? Had nothing to do with the politicians back in Berlin. But this was like a plot to basically pass the buck, pass the responsibility over to the politicians. Give them the power, give them the unpleasant task that goes with it of having to sign the peace treaty. And then barely have these politicians taken on the power and the responsibility, and suddenly they're going to be saddled with being the people who had basically stabbed the country in the back, and so democracy will be dead in the duck even as it has only just started, okay, in terms of popularity. Okay, so that's kind of like what the in other words, the myth is that we've lost the war not because of military weakness but because of socialist traitors. Okay, so that's the stab in the back myth. Now, why is that so significant? Okay, this sort of stab in the back myth. Okay, then again, there's another picture. Okay, so you've got sort of like a good German soldier standing there on the Western Front, facing the British and the French and the Americans, and sneaking up behind him is a German working class person with his knife. Okay, and that's a metaphor, isn't it? It's representing this sort of story that we've just said. But the reality, of course, is it wasn't true. These German soldiers on the Western Front were basically dropping their weapons, were turning around and were running back to Germany. Okay, they were not being stabbed in the back by the German political leaders back in Berlin. But nevertheless, these sorts of pictures and cartoons were being published in Germany, and they were believed. Now, why is that important? Okay, so the stab in the back myth, just to clarify, is this: Germany had not really lost the war, but had been betrayed on the home front by the political left. It was a lie, but that was the myth. It was a powerful myth. Okay, it lingered for years and years and years, and in fact, it did more than that. It grew. It became more powerful. Whenever bad times hit Germany in the first few years after World War One, people would look around for something to make sense of their misery. Okay, And it was a great thing to grab hold of, okay? So people would latch on to this. Yeah, it's the people, it's the left-wing politicians, it's the Social Democratic Party, it's people like Hebert and Scheidemann, his deputy. They are the bad guys. They are the ones who stabbed Germany in the back, who are responsible for Germany losing World War One, even though that wasn't true. Okay, so in later years, when bad times hit Germany, opponents of the German government would use the stab in the back myth as a way of gathering support for themselves. And there's no better example of that than, of course, we're talking about right-wing political opponents, because the people in charge of government in 1918 were left-wing, like the SPD. They dominated the Reichstag. And so when difficult times returned, right-wing political opponents who believed in the stab in the back would use the stab in the back myth to attack the new republic, the new Weimar Republic, the new German system, as it was called after the end of World War One, and they would attack the leaders as being traitors to the nation. And of course, who are we talking about when we talk about right-wing political opponents? Well, of course, the most famous example of that was a new political party called the Nazi Party that was formed in 1920. In 1923, Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, constantly spoke about the stab in the back. That was part and parcel of Nazi messages. We have been betrayed by the government in Berlin, and the people who believed in the stab in the back myth turned to Hitler and gave Hitler their support. And it grew and grew and grew, such that by 10 years after that, in the early 1930s, Hitler was strong enough to topple the government in Berlin. Okay, so it's a genuinely important myth. Okay, it was not true, but nevertheless, perception is reality, and if people perceived this myth as being the reality, then it has an impact on history. Okay, so that's the change in direction that we're talking about, Ludendorff's change in direction. Okay, so now then, let's talk about the October Reform. Well, we've already mentioned what the October Reform was. Okay, so just go back to the point. Okay, so Ludendorff now at the Western Front, and of course the German army is in rapid retreat, and German soldiers are deserting and putting their guns down, and Ludendorff has gone to the Kaiser in Berlin and has said, look, we're going to have to end this war, but if we just end it like this, then there'll be a full-blown revolution. People will say, why have we been fighting this war for 4 years and we're getting nothing out of it? So we've got to give the people something so that they feel the war isn't a waste of time. So they thought, well, hold it there, what are we going to do? And basically they reluctantly agreed, we're going to have to give the Reichstag more power. We're going to have to share power with the Reichstag and give the Reichstag genuine political power. If we do that, it might hopefully nip revolution in the bud. It may convince ordinary German people that, yeah, we've got something out of the war. Okay, so they then had to think, well, who's going to go to the Reichstag and tell the Reichstag this? This is a pretty unsavoury job to have to go and do. So they got rid of Michaelis, the Chancellor, and they found a guy who was one of their own. He was an upper class, he was a prince, called Prince Max von Baden. And the thing about Prince Max von Baden, he was an unusual prince. Most princes were very authoritarian, they didn't really believe in power sharing, but Prince Max von Baden was a liberal. Okay, he was quite liberal in his views. He genuinely believed that it was important to give more power to the Reichstag, to give ordinary people a greater say in the running of their country. So he was the perfect person to draw up the proposal. So in October 1918, and here we're on the text, in October 1918, the new Chancellor, Prince Max von Baden, drafted a proposed change to the Constitution. Okay. Now, of course, the Constitution that was there was written in 1871, and Bismarck had been sort of like the key mastermind, of course, in the 1871 Constitution. We did that right at the beginning of the course. And the 1871 Constitution, of course, Bismarck created an illusion that the Reichstag had power, but they didn't really have power. Remember, in the end, the Chancellor was not accountable to the Reichstag. He was only accountable upwards to the Kaiser. The army and the navy were not accountable to the Reichstag. They were only accountable to the Kaiser. Real power lay at the top with the Kaiser. But the Reichstag, yeah, it had the power to approve laws, to pass laws, but real power did not lie with the Reichstag. But suddenly, Prince Max is redrafted the Constitution. And basically, what this new draft of the Constitution did is it proposed that Germany become a constitutional monarchy. Now, what that basically means is we will keep the monarchy, in other words, the Kaiser, the Emperor. Okay, we're not going to get rid of the Emperor. We'll still have a monarch, but there will be much less power with the monarch, with the Kaiser, and a lot more power with the ordinary people who are represented in the Reichstag. And from now on, okay, the Chancellor, the head of government, will be accountable to the Reichstag and not to the Kaiser. The army and the navy will be accountable to the people, the Reichstag, not to the Kaiser. And also, that three-tier voting system in Prussia will be abolished. Okay, so every vote will be equal in Prussia. Remember, Prussia made up 60% of the whole of Germany, so that was a pretty significant change as well. So this is what we call the October Reform. It was a rewriting of the Constitution during World War One. Okay, and it was presented to the Reichstag on the 28th of October, and without any surprise, obviously the Reichstag said, yes, please, we'll take that. We'll take that. Okay, because it's what they had been asking for years and years and years, a fairer, more democratic system. So it was passed. Okay, so it was a remarkable political reform which significantly shifted power downwards, away from the Kaiser and from the elites, and it gave a lot more power to the ordinary German people. And of course, the Reichstag is the representative body of ordinary Germans. Okay. Now, as we said, the elites, the conservatives, the people at the top, the Kaiser, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the military leaders, Prince Max, the Chancellor, the head of government, all hoped that by doing this, by changing the Constitution, it would give those restless masses, the ordinary Germans who are out on the streets, who are striking and who are talking to each other about what's happening in Russia. Should we topple the Kaiser? Should we basically have them all killed, massacre the middle classes, do what's, a butchering, basically, such as is happening in the East over in Russia? Shall we go that way? And of course, the hope was that if we announce this October reform, that it will persuade these ordinary Germans who are very unhappy that there's no need for there to be a revolution. Okay? We will avoid what happened in Russia, which is basically saying we will save our own skins. We'll still be able to keep a monarch. The upper classes will still keep their jobs, their positions, but we'll give a bit more power to the ordinary people. Okay? So that was basically the intention. And the big question, of course, is, was it a case of too little, too late? Okay? So that's what the October Reform was about. So let's have a look at the in a nutshell slide. And those are the questions. And hopefully we've answered most of these, but we'll just go through them. So why might the October Reforms be described as a revolution? Okay. Well, remember, a revolution is a significant change. And the October Reforms were arguably a revolution because they turned Germany into a constitutional monarchy. Now, that's a bit like what we've got in England today. We have a monarchy, we have a queen, upper class, an elite, but actually she has very little power, okay? The real power lies with our House of Commons, the members of Parliament who sit in the House of Commons that represent us, and our head of government the Prime Minister of England, does not give account to the Queen, but he gives account to Parliament for the decisions of government. Okay, and is held responsible to the people. And if the people aren't happy, then the people will basically every 5 years will vote in elections, and the head of government could be voted out. The ruling party could be voted out. So basically, the October reforms is basically turning Germany into a constitutional monarchy, such in many ways similar to the way in which our government works today in the 21st century. So, as I say, the Chancellor and the military would no longer be accountable to the Reichstag, and the Prussian three-tier voting system was abolished. Next question, number 2, why were the October reforms a revolution from above? Okay, so that's an important phrase, a revolution from above. Now, a revolution from below is like what happened in Russia. Okay, it's when you've got the kind of like, again, think of our pyramid, our social pyramid. Okay, so from below is basically the ordinary people, the working classes on the streets, rising up and basically taking control of things. Okay, and in Russia they rose up, and Lenin and the Bolsheviks took control over St. Petersburg and basically overthrew the Russian monarch, the emperor, the Tsar. Okay, so what made that happen was the sort of like arguably what made that happen was the sort of like the ordinary millions of Russian people had had enough. Okay, that's what we'd call about a revolution from below. Now, was that really what was happening in Germany? Because arguably it wasn't, because this change actually was from above. Okay, it was by decision of Ludendorff talking to the Kaiser and giving Prince Max a job. Let's change the constitution before the boiling pot beneath us bubbles over and turns into a full-blown revolution. Okay, so the point is it was a significant change to the way Germany was run, but it was decided upon by a small group of people before, I say that analogy of a bubbling, simmering discontent below spilled over into a full-blown revolution on the streets. It was to prevent a full-blown revolution on the streets. So it was a significant change, but it was from above, not from below. Okay. Next question. Can you give a counter-argument that the reforms were not really a revolution? Okay. So here's when we say a counter-argument, there are some historians who would say, actually, the October reforms were not really a massive change. Now, we've just said it was, okay? Why was it a massive change? Because it basically, arguably, significantly shifted power downwards. It gave a lot more power to the Reichstag than had been given to them by the original constitution written by Bismarck in 1871, and you could argue that was a significant change, that was a revolution. But there are some historians who would argue this, okay? They would argue that the changes were not, the October reform was not a revolution, because it was not a significant enough change, okay? Why was it not significant? Well, it may have given more power to the Reichstag, but the old order, the Kaiser, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, the military leaders, the princes, Prince Max, the King of Bavaria, etc., they may hold less power, but they are still there holding some power. Okay? A proper revolution would topple them completely. It would completely change the system. Okay, a proper revolution. A proper revolution, for example, would get rid of the Kaiser, it would get rid of the King of Bavaria, the Duke of Saxony, all the princes. It would simply abolish them and would declare that Germany is now a republic without any monarchs. Okay? But the October reform isn't saying that. It's simply saying we will keep the monarchy, which means we'll keep the emperor, and we will also keep the grand dukes and the princes and the kings of the separate states. We'll keep all of that, but we'll just do a bit more power sharing with the ordinary people. Is that really a revolution? The argument is it is more an evolution, a gradual change. It is a change, but to call it a revolution is going too far. If you're going to find the right word, you would say that's a gradual change. Okay, a revolution is a sudden, violent change. Okay, whereas shifting power down to the Reichstag, but keeping the old monarchs, etc., there is not really a revolution. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4, how did the moderate left wing react to the October reforms and why? Okay, so remember the moderate left wings were people like this man here. Okay, the leader of the SPD, or the majority SPD as we talk about, as we call them now that the independents have broken away. Okay, so remember there were 110 members of the SPD, 18 broke away to form the USPD, which is a bit more on the extreme left, but the majority left behind were fairly centre. They wanted to work with the centre party and the middle ground of politics. And Hebert, the leader of the SPD, his party is still the largest party in the Reichstag. Okay, so and he's basically although he's left wing and he believes in Marxist ideas, he wants to see more power to the working classes. He basically believes in democracy and he believes in law and order and peace. He doesn't want to go down the path of a violent revolution and giving power to workers' councils, such as has happened or is happening at that time in Russia. Okay, he believes in due process, in democracy, and he doesn't want to take power completely away from the middle classes. He believes it's important to manage democracy peacefully. Okay, so the question is, how did the moderate left wing react to the October reforms and why? Okay, so the MSPD were the largest party in the Reichstag, led by Hebert, and they basically were prepared to accept the October reform. Okay, because for the reasons I've just said, it was a substantial step towards democracy. It is genuinely giving a greater say in the running of the country to the elected representatives of the people. Okay, and it's proposing doing that without bloodshed or violence. So he saw it as a big step forward, and that's why the MSPD voted for it on the 28th of October when Prince Max walked into the Reichstag and said, here we are, I've got a proposal, I'm changing Bismarck's constitution, I want to give more power to you guys. They accepted it. Okay, but interestingly, and this is the point for the next question, it asks, what about the radical left wing? What about those groups on the far left? The USPD, the 18 deputies who broke away from the SPD, okay, and in particular those revolutionary groups on the street, like the Spartacists and the revolutionary shop stewards, who very strongly believe that Germany should go in the same direction as what's happened in Russia. Now remember, in Russia, Lenin arrived on his train and the Bolsheviks basically planned a takeover of the capital city. And for 6 months, ever since the abdication of the Russian Tsar, Russia had been run by the Russian parliament, the Duma. Okay? And again, you could say, well, a parliament is a fair system. It represents the people, represents all the people. It represents the rich and the poor. It represents the middle classes and the working classes. But Lenin wasn't interested in giving any power to the middle classes. He simply wanted to give power to the workers, and that Russia would be run through workers' councils. So Lenin in Russia, after the takeover, shut down the Duma and declared all power to the Soviets. The power now lies with the working class men and women in their councils. Okay, and basically what we're saying is that the USPD, the Independent Socialists, and the revolutionary shop stewards, particularly the RSS and the Spartacists, but also elements of the USPD, were very, very committed to the Russian approach. Okay, So they actually refused to accept the October reform. They saw it as a sellout, because giving more power to the Reichstag, in their view, meant, well, some of the political parties in the Reichstag represented the middle classes and the upper classes. Okay, so you've got the National Liberals, you've got the Centre Party, you've got the German Conservatives. Well, they are members of the Reichstag and they represent the fairly well-off Germans. And the USPD and the revolutionary shop stewards and the Spartacists believed that power should be given to the poor Germans, the ordinary working people in the factories and in the fields. So they would argue that the October reform was just window dressing. It was too little too late. It was evidence that really the elites are just trying to save their own skins by giving, at the last minute, a bit more power to ordinary people. And they're not prepared to be duped. They're not prepared to be fooled with that type of window dressing promise. Okay? In their view, if you're a radical, the old order should be completely removed from power, as has happened in Russia. And just allowing them to stay there, allowing the monarchs, the Kaiser and the princes and the kings to keep their positions, and with a bit of power sharing through elected parliaments, wasn't enough. Okay? So that's it in a nutshell. So the remainder of the, just quickly sort of like have a quick look through the slides, and I'll just tick them to make sure we're happy with it. So 3rd of October 1918, Chancellor Max von Baden wrote to the American president asking for an armistice. An armistice means a ceasefire. Okay, stop fighting. Will you agree to that? And of course, as we know, Woodrow Wilson said, yeah, well, we'll agree to it, but you've got to basically give me a clear signal that the government we're going to negotiate with will be a democratic government that will genuinely represent the German people, not just the rich. So Max says, well, okay, well, give me a few weeks and I'm going to have to go away and sort that out. And of course, that's the whole basis behind then what happened. Okay, so 3 weeks later, Ludendorff, having engineered this, quietly handed in his resignation. He doesn't want anything to do with it, remember. He doesn't want to be associated with this unpleasantness about giving power to the ordinary people. So Prince Max, having been given this dirty job to do, then set about making constitutional changes, which would turn Germany into a constitutional monarchy. And those changes were voted in the Reichstag on the 28th of October. And as we said, those changes abolished the three-class voting system in Prussia. It made the army and the navy accountable to the Reichstag, not the Kaiser, and it made the Chancellor and his government accountable to the Reichstag, not to the Kaiser. Okay? So remember, I've done a before and after diagram here. So there's Bismarck's constitution, and very importantly, the Kaiser, if you look here, the Kaiser appointed the imperial government. Okay, and the Reichstag on the side there had no say in the choosing of the government. And the Reichstag, of course, has been appointed by all German males. Okay, but now, according to the October Reform, get rid of that arrow and replace it with a new arrow. The imperial government is now appointed by the Reichstag. So more power, therefore, is given to the Reichstag, and by definition, therefore, you're giving power to the ordinary people, or at least to all German men over the age of 25. So that's what that represents. Okay, it is in effect going to turn Germany into a constitutional monarchy. Okay, where the monarchs, and that's not just the Kaiser, but it's also the kings and the princes of the different states, are now going to have far less power than they've had before. So there we've got the bit about point number 4. The October reforms was a revolution from above. i.e. those in power, had instigated change from above in an orderly fashion. The monarchy would be retained. I want to say monarchy, remember, not just the Kaiser, but there were 22 other monarchs, weren't there? Okay, the Kaiser is also the King of Prussia. He'll carry on being the King of Prussia. King of Bavaria will keep his crown, and so on. But considerable power has now been passed from the monarchy to the people's representatives. Now, this man here, Hebert, the leader of the SPD, the majority SPD, and other moderate politicians like Erzberger from the Centre Party, the National Liberals, progressives of the left liberals, were on the whole very happy with the October reforms. That's why they voted for them. They believed they were substantial, there was therefore no need to go beyond them. And it seemed that law and order had been kept because they could now go to the people and say, look, the war hasn't been a complete waste of time. You, the people, have got something out of it. It has at least brought about that type of change. Okay? But you're looking at the simmering discontent on the streets and you're asking that question, what's going through the minds of these people who are reading in their pamphlets about the Russian Revolution? And are they going to be happy to be told there's been a reform to the German constitution? Is that really going to be enough for them? Okay? And so the point is this, the events that then followed, and we'll look at that, this next lesson, proved them wrong. Because what then happened in November showed that the October reforms had been a case of too little too late. Okay? Why? Because the extremists on the far left saw these concessions to be window dressing and were determined to push for a more radical political action. And that is what we'll look at in our next lesson. What then happened in November 1918. Because yes, the October reforms proved to be too little too late. They didn't last very long. They were overtaken by events which, by literally less than 2 weeks later, okay, in November the 9th, 1918, the monarchy ended. The Kaiser abdicated and all the other kings and princes likewise abdicated, and events quickly overtook and Germany effectively became a republic, which was arguably the real revolution. But that's the story for next lesson. Okay. There are two sources at the back of the notes, so make sure you have a look at those. A diary by a man called Thayer and the memoirs of Hindenburg that he wrote in 1920 after the war. I'm giving you some prompts there, 4 questions, just because we're kind of moving towards the point in the course where we're going to start to look at how to analyse sources. Okay, so like I pointed out in yesterday's lesson, you should be reading these sources and be underlining and highlighting and just making sure you comprehend them, and that you thinking to yourself, what's the value of this source to a historian, which is what it's about when it comes to source analysis. Okay, and there's a reminder then. So we're looking at the events of November 1918, and it'll go through to January 1919. But the title of the lesson is Defeat, Disintegration, Revolution, and these are the things I want you to look at. The growing calls for the abdication of the Kaiser, the fact that the October reform wasn't enough, the Kiel mutiny, which triggered, there's that thing, the revolution from below. It did actually simmer over, the boiling pot overflowed, and Soviets were set up, such as in Russia. The Kaiser and the other monarchs abdicated, and a caretaker government was put into power, led by Hebert, the leader of the Social Democrats. That's what we'll do next time. That's finished off the lesson properly. Okay, so make sure, please, that you give me a thumbs up emoji on the post that I've announced this YouTube video, just so I know that you have done what you need to do, so when I see you next, we're all at the same position. Thanks very much. That's the end of this video.